What happens to an artist that takes them from an entertaining performer that you see in a local dive bar to an icon that people camp out in front of stadiums for days to go and see? A Complete Unknown, a biopic from Bob Dylan's early career, gets us to an interesting answer to this question. In addition to being a really great movie, it captures Bob Dylan's soul in a really profound way.
I got these special binoculars, and they allow me to see into your soul.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
It's the small details around the life of this enigmatic songwriter that give what he did meaning. They give his songs meaning. If you know Dylan, you definitely know his iconic sound. And I don't think it'd be controversial to say that he's not a particularly spectacular singer, nor is there any real complexity to the instrumentals in most of his songs. So what is it? Obviously, if it wasn't his singing voice or his superior talent with instruments, then the songwriting of Bob Dylan must be what brought him fame. And yes, Bob Dylan may be one of the best songwriters of all time, but that isn't the whole story. If it was just his songwriting skill, Bob Dylan would have probably ended up a ghostwriter for talents like Johnny Cash and Joan Baez, and nobody would really know his face or name. But obviously, since I'm here talking about this today, Dylan was more than that. There's something about Dylan as a performer, Dylan as a man, that connects with people deeply, deeper than most artists ever achieve. So let's unpack the film A Complete Unknown and discover why Bob Dylan remains one of the most prominent and iconic figures in music to this day. So as always, I'm going to list out some of my favorite things about this movie, and then I'll relate them back to my thesis statement. The film begins when Dylan arrives in New York in 1960. I want to interject here and say that this film fictionalizes some events and plays a little fast and loose with timelines, and I don't care about that at all. Biopics do it all the time. You kind of have to do it to make a life interesting to watch on screen, so I'm not going to address it again. If you want to know more about it, there's a great Variety article that I'll link in the description. So Dylan arrives in New York with basically nothing but a guitar, and he sets out on a mission to meet his folk hero, Woody Guthrie, who's accompanied in the hospital by Pete Seeger. This sequence does a really great job of setting up Dylan as this kind of shy, awkward, introverted character, and it shows very clearly that the only way he really expresses himself is through music. This is also where we get Chalamet's first performance as Dylan, and he freaking nails it. It's actually amazing how close he gets to Bob Dylan's voice, and if I'm being honest, I almost like Chalamet's voice better because I can actually understand what he's saying when he's singing. So here, early on in the movie, we're faced with the problem that leads into my larger thesis about this movie. Bob Dylan isn't someone who's going to tell you who he is or what he's about.
You're kind of an asshole, Bob.
Dylan is notoriously kind of an enigma, but it's the authenticity in this first performance that really strikes you. It's the reserved start, and then his confidence builds as he can see Woody and Pete enjoying. Dylan bears his soul to Seeger and Guthrie, and it's this honest, naked vulnerability that really makes great music. And this is a point that I'm going to continue to hit throughout this video. This performance leads directly into my next slide. Pete Seeger, as performed by Edward Norton, takes Dylan under his wing, giving him a place to sleep and introducing him to the New York City folk scene. Pete's role in this movie is to be the figurehead of old-fashioned folk music and to be kind of enamored with Bob Dylan. He's kind of a boring older guy, and his larger mission is to bring folk music to the mainstream, which, with the help of Bob Dylan, he actually manages. He serves as kind of a spiritual guide for Dylan and his musical progression. And this character's main purpose in the plot is to really raise the stakes when Dylan starts pushing boundaries later on and expanding from folk into more of a rock and roll sound. This movie is set at the very start of Dylan's career in the early 60s. And with that, there's a turbulent political background that's set up behind the plot of this movie. This political background sets the stage for my next slide. I love the integration of American history in this movie. We see a little bit of Dylan's involvement with some civil rights movements, but for the most part, we don't get some of that. I think that's actually something the movie could use more of, but this movie does a really nice job setting the scene with set design and the color grade that isn't too filter heavy and using the camera to make you feel like you're actually there. It really feels like you're watching this take place in the 1960s. I think the era is best depicted in the scene where the Cuban Missile Crisis is happening. There's a panic across New York City. Live news reports are continually coming in, and it seems as though a nuclear war is imminent. In this scene, Joan Baez is fleeing the city, and she runs past a homeless guy playing a tambourine on the street with not a care in the world. Slightly further down the road, we find Dylan singing Masters of War in a bar. Dylan and every other patron in the bar left without a care in the world. None of them were considering what was very possibly coming to their city in the next few hours, which was very possibly all of their deaths. I think we forget often how close we came to a nuclear war in that day, but I know that there were keys in the ignition of nuclear missiles in the United States. It is a terrifying thing to think about, and that day was 10 seconds away from ending the world as we know it. Through all of that panic, however, Dylan didn't change at all. He was exactly who he always was. Precisely himself. I think that moves nicely into my next point. There are a few points in this movie where Bob expresses some disinterested commentary into why he's such a great songwriter. The most telling of these is his conversation with Joan, in which he tells her that she tries too hard if she has to ask how he writes these songs.
You tried too hard to write.
Really?
Yeah, if you're asking.
I wasn't.
Your songs are like an oil painting at the dentist's office.
In a separate scene, he makes the statement that they don't want to know how he writes the songs. They want to know why the songs don't come to them.
Everyone asks where these songs come from. When you watch their faces, they're not asking where the songs come from.
If invasion is undertaken, Russians have said that.
They're asking why songs didn't come to them.
As any writer would tell you, the ideas are not precisely theirs. The ideas seem to appear out of nowhere into the conscious mind. Anyone can understand the feeling of being surprised by a thought. And when you're struck by an idea, be it for a book, a movie, a YouTube video, or a song, it's exactly that same feeling. I believe that these things come from the unconscious mind. I believe that psychoanalyst Carl Jung was largely right about the nature of the unconscious. That it exists in two parts. It's made up of both the collective unconscious, which all minds seem to have access to, and the personal unconscious, which is characterized specifically by your genetic makeup and your personal experiences. I like to think of these unconsciouses in greater terms as the realm of ideas themselves. It's my belief that the personal unconscious is akin to a soul. It may not be provably real in a traditional material sense, but as an idea, it's extremely powerful. And we all act as though it's real. We all act as though we have some kind of higher value, that our experiences and characterizations of life somehow make up a greater us than just our physical flesh sacks that are full of meat and bone. It's this idea that has led us to believe that all life is important, that somehow we are more, that the idea of us, the idea of our lives is more. That's what I believe the soul is. If you live truthfully, meaning that you don't lie to others or, more importantly, to yourself about who you are, you can start to connect with your unconscious mind. You can start to understand the unconscious thoughts that drive you. Carl Jung called the process of understanding your unconscious individuation. It's through this process that you connect with the place where ideas come from. And I believe that Dylan, and really any great artist, is well connected with this area of thought. When ideas come to them, they know how to listen. And it's in this moment where they connect their soul to their art. As you experience it, as it comes to you, you characterize it through your own interpretation. This is when it becomes yours. You forever link it to yourself. And when a great musician like Bob Dylan performs, the audience experiences a piece of them. When I say Bob Dylan bears his soul on stage, I mean it. I mean it literally. I think that is actually what he's doing. When Dylan performs, that is when he is most authentically himself. And we all watch because that's when the collective unconscious connects with a human being, with the personal unconscious, with a soul, and something new is created out of it. I feel like I may be getting a little too abstract, so let me stop for a second and just give props to Timothée Chalamet. He's definitely getting the credit that he deserves for this performance because he was incredible. He completely disappears into this role. You could really believe that you were actually watching Bob Dylan live from the 60s. People are talking like he's gonna win an Oscar, and I absolutely see why. I haven't seen a lot of new releases this year, so I don't know what else is out there, but he definitely deserves the buzz for this role. So one of my likes goes to Timothy for this film. In a moment, I'm gonna go through a complete unknown and give it a rating out of 10, but first I have one more like from this film, and once again it stems from a quote from Dylan. Shortly after his rise to stardom, Dylan finds himself at a party full of fans. As he's leaving, he's in the elevator and he makes the comment, 200 people all here want me to be somebody else.
200 people in that room, and each one wants me to be somebody else. They should just let me be.
Let you be what?
Whatever it is they don't want me to be.
I think it's in this moment when Dylan chooses to switch up his style from traditional folk music. This is where the idea begins. Dylan is fighting to keep being himself. If you start bending to the wills of the crowd, then you start lying. You start slowly becoming the person that the crowd wants, rather than the person that is authentically bearing their soul on stage. And I really think this is like selling your soul. When you start making little concessions in who you are to please the crowd, parts of you start to slip away. It's no coincidence that the story of selling your soul to Satan for guitar skill has been around for generations. If you allow yourself to be manipulated and to be shaped by what everyone else wants from you, you'll start to tell small lies that will slowly corrupt you. You will be unable to be the person your unconscious is looking to be because you will no longer be able to live truth. Eventually, the person you were is buried by these lies. This is why Dylan going against the crowd, playing the music that he wants, is so important.
Sure they want to hear what I want to play, Johnny.
I want to hear it.
Because he manages in this way to keep himself intact. So what does all this mean anyway? And does it make for a good movie? Or am I just some crazy guy rambling about souls into a camera alone in a room? As for my mental state, I really can't speak to my own sanity, but I think I can fairly give this movie a grade. And after that, I'll try to sum this whole thing up in some nice, satisfying way that lets us all feel a little bit happier and gets you to click like and subscribe. In scoring, we're already off to a strong start because I really didn't have any dislikes for this movie. There was not much I could find to nitpick, and I will admit to a certain amount of bias here because I already liked Dylan and I didn't know much about his early career, so I was primed to like this movie from the very beginning. But the plot is really strong, and after all, it's a biopic, so it's pretty hard to screw up a plot that's already set in stone for you. All you have to do is rearrange some events to get your pacing right and make sure that the movie flows well. And I do like that the chosen conflict for this movie was kind of Bob Dylan up against his own audience. I think this choice makes the movie more interesting and nuanced than your average musical biopic, and I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10, and the only reason it's not higher is because all of these were real life events, so all the writers had to do was make sure it was paced correctly and add enough emotional stakes to keep you engaged. The writing in this movie is also really good. They do a great job portraying Dylan as this kind of awkward weirdo. The dialogue is also good. The story does rely a lot on the music, especially for some emotional tension, but I can't knock it too much for that. After all, it's a biopic about a musician. I would expect you to use some music, so I think I'll give it another 8 out of 10. I think the characters are where this movie struggles a little bit. Especially Sylvie seems a little bit underdeveloped. I like that she was a part of Core, and they kind of framed it that she was part of the reason that Bob Dylan got into political writing in the first place, but I think there was more to get out of that. Pete and Joan are definitely a little bit better developed, but I still think there was a little bit more that we could have gotten out of them to really get the audience to attach deeper to characters that weren't just Dylan. And doing this would have made Dylan's actions feel a lot worse early in the movie. I won't spoil too much here for you, but he wasn't always the nicest guy. And I think some more emotional stakes for the side characters in the movie would make that point hit home a little bit harder. However, I think Bob Dylan's character is dead accurate. It is so well done. And it's not just the performance from Chalamet that makes it so good. It's well written, it's well developed, as it should be. I mean, Bob Dylan was advising on the film, so if he couldn't write his own character, that would be pretty bad. But I don't think the character is far from perfect. So with the Bob Dylan character being a 10 out of 10 and the other ones probably being a 4, I think I'm gonna knock the characters down to about a 6 out of 10. So it sits slightly just above average. I think the cinematography is another really strong feature of this movie. I love the way this movie's shot. It makes you feel like kind of an active participant in the story. And as I mentioned earlier, the set design feels really authentically 1960s. You manage to feel like an audience member, and it's really beautiful. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Finally, I think this is probably one of my favorite movies thematically that I've ever seen. And again, I will address that I am a little bit biased here, given that I was already a Dylan fan going in. I think the theme lies within some things that I was addressing earlier. The theme is kind of addressed right in the title. Dylan has to remain a complete unknown in order to be authentically what he is. What he is lies within his music, and once it has become familiar and understood, it's no longer an authentic representation because time has passed it by. So Dylan is forced to move faster ahead than his audience. Artists have to stay on the fringe even when the crowd wants them to stay as they are. If you allow yourself to become a puppet of the crowd, it makes you useless as an artist. It makes you corporate and greedy and uninteresting. A puppet of the crowd may be popular for a time, but a person who stays authentically themselves, who bears their soul to the crowd, they will remain intact as a person the crowd can look up. They will remain an icon. They'll be looked at as someone who left society something truly valuable and added something new. So the theme gets a 10 out of 10. Totaled up, A Complete Unknown gets an 8.5 5 out of 10. And all in, I liked this movie even better than the score suggests. But like I said, I was primed to like this movie from the very beginning. But I liked it so much because I felt that it so perfectly captured something that you can't put into words. It's a rare movie. This is why I keep talking about Dylan bearing his soul. Dylan fundamentally understood what he was, who he was, couldn't be put into words. This is why he lies and makes up his past and says that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, these chords I learned from a cowboy named Wigglefoot.
You were in a carnival. You are so completely full of shit.
People characterize their past based on their own biases, based on what they think happened, based on what they wanted to have happen. But Dylan just allows himself to be seen through music. And this is what great music does for us. Much like any art form, it captures the things that we can't explain. And music does this on the most abstract level. I think music is a direct connection to what people refer to as the soul. I think it's a direct connection to the collective unconscious and to the personal unconscious of the author. These are the kinds of things that Carl Jung theorized about. And I don't think you have to be religious to believe in that either. I think when you look deeply at human behavior, it becomes obvious that an idea can be just as real as the physical world. And the music that Bob Dylan wrote was the idea that made him who he was. And that's one of the most powerful things that human beings can do. His music is the most important part of understanding him. You don't need to know about his past to know Bob Dylan. And this movie did an absolutely exceptional job of capturing that idea. Ideas, whether they're expressed in fiction, myth, art, or music, they're where our soul resides. They're what we leave behind when we die. They're what carries society forward. It's great music like Bob Dylan's. It's the great art from artists like Shakespeare that have helped us develop as a culture. It's our stories and our art that keep us together as a species. Our ideas are all that we have. So that is why Bob Dylan is still an icon and one of the greatest of all time. On that, please hit like and subscribe if you like this video. Comment if you didn't like it and let me know why. Just try to be tactful about it. And check out one of my other videos. Recently I did a video taking apart The Breakfast Club.